Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Judy, and thank you all for having me. As John said, I'm a professor at Keene State College, a professor of history, specifically German history. My very, very narrow area of expertise, because as you go further in your education, you know more and more about less and less. So my very narrow expertise is actually the history of late 18th and early 19th German philosophy. I've written a couple of books about that. But I teach German history, modern German history, 19th and 20th century. And I'm also on the board of New Hampshire Humanities, a great organization that I encourage you to look up. They do a lot of great programming, and we are hurting like a lot of organizations right now. Half of our funding has now been taken away as NEH funds have been slashed. And it's an organization that really relies upon federal matching funds as well as donations to kind of make it work. So that's another kind of hat I wear is on the board of directors at New Hampshire Humanities. But tonight I'm going to talk about the idea originally was kind of Nazi electoral success in the 1920s and early 1930s and kind of parallels between what happened then and there and what we're seeing now. And I'm going to give you, there are a couple of different ways to do it. What I'm not going to do is to get into the nitty-gritty of the various election cycles. That's very interesting to somebody like me, but I'm going to try to kind of remain at a higher level and talk about some basic themes that I want to focus on that I think are really applicable to what we are looking at right now. All right? And there are three main themes I'm really going to touch on that I think are most relevant. Number one, when we think about the conditions that led to the rise of the Nazis in the 1920s and early 30s, and that unfortunately we are also seeing here in the United States today. There are three of them that I'm going to focus on. Number one is the weakness of the establishment conservative right. All right? Conservatives and populists generally don't go well together, right? If the conservative political establishment, here think about the Mitt Romney Republican Party, and the George H.W. Bush Republican Party. If the establishment conservative party could win elections without the populists, they would. They don't want the populists. It's an uneasy relationship. But the fact of the matter is, in the 1920s in Germany and what we're seeing today, the establishment conservative party is too weak to win electoral victories. So they create an alliance with the radical far right, the populists, in order to tap into an electoral base, right? So number one, the weakness of an establishment conservative party. Number two, the fragmentation of the left. In Germany, I'm going to talk about the two major left-wing parties, the Communist Party and the Social Democrats. And the communists on the far left referred to the Social Democrats, who were a Marxist party, referred to the Social Democrats as social fascists. And they ran just as hard against the Social Democrats, even harder really, against the Social Democrats than they did against the fascists in the 20s. And so this tears apart the political left. So you have a political right which consolidates with an establishment conservative party, with the far right, populists, and you have a fragmented left, right? And then also what happens is the center collapses. And that's kind of the third piece that I'm going to focus on, which is a loss of faith in establishment institutions. And that's where the center usually is in association with the institutions of a democratic republic. So those are the things I'm going to come back to, those three major themes. The weakness of the establishment right, the left turning against itself, a fragmented left, and loss of faith in institutions, and the consequent collapse of the center, political and cultural center. So I want to give a little bit of an overview, right? The danger of asking a historian to talk in any subject, right, is that we're always interested in the roots of things, right? And before there was this, there was something else. And before there was that, there was something else, right? And you have to, from our perspective, we could go back to the Stone Age to figure out how we get here. But to go back a little bit to the 19th century, which sets up the developments of Germany in the 1920s. In the middle of the 19th century, 1860s, roughly around the time Germany is unified in 1871, Germany, by the way, has an interesting process, a little bit similar to the United States, in the sense that if we look at the United States between 1776 and the Civil War, right, between the American Revolution and the Civil War, the conflict here was between a central government and the states, right? So it was this tension between a centralizing tendency and the desire to keep states' rights. The same thing was true in Germany. Germany had been what was called the Holy Roman Empire, going back many centuries. As Voltaire once said, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But beginning in the late 18th century, around the time that the United States comes into existence, we see this move towards centralization, particularly in Prussia in the north and Austria in the south. All right? And it's on a very similar timeline. It's in 1870 when Germany is unified under Bismarck and the Prussians. So it's similar to, if you take this kind of 1776 to roughly 1870, there are similar dynamics in terms of a conflict between an emerging strong central federal government and state governments. And ultimately, they both end in the 1860s with a much more powerful central government. But if we look at Germany in that time period in the 1860s, all right, there are two kind of major, really two political parties. This is an oversimplification, of course. But we have liberals and conservatives, broadly speaking, right? So liberals are liberals in the sense that they want economic reforms. They want more, basically they want Germany to be more like England. A good example of German liberalism is actually Kaiser Wilhelm II's father, Friedrich III, who was only emperor for about 60 days, Kaiser. But he was married to one of Queen Victoria's daughters. He was very enamored of the British system of constitutional monarchy and of English trade and commerce, right? So there was this movement in Germany that was liberal and was particularly enamored with the English style liberalism, both politically and in terms of trade and commerce. They wanted slightly more, not radically, but slightly more liberal voting laws. The conservatives, Bismarck is a perfect example of this. The conservatives were aristocrats and they were monarchists. Bismarck was a Junker. That is, he came from an aristocratic class in Eastern Prussia. Their wealth was really in land, right? Serfdom lasts longest in this part of Germany. And they are still they're fighting this reactionary movement to hold on to ways of life that had dominated Europe in the earlier part of the 19th century. So this was the basic landscape. But what happens in Germany is, starting in about the 1860s, Bismarck becomes Chancellor of Prussia in, I think, 1858 or 59, is northern Germany in particular industrializes, right? It industrializes rapidly. Britain had been undergoing industrialization, decades earlier. France had been before Germany. Germany industrializes rapidly, 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. And what this does is it creates a tremendous amount of social disruption, right? It creates a couple of new classes of Germans that had not existed before, one of which is the proletariat. Marx is starting to write about this in 1848 with the Communist Manifesto, but he's mainly looking at France and England. There's no real proletariat, that is industrial working class, in Germany in that time period. That comes later, 1860s and 1870s. But when it comes fast. It comes hard and fast, much quicker than it did in both Britain or France. So it's more socially disruptive. Cities explode in terms of their population rapidly, right, because of industrialization, right? The other class which emerges in Germany, which is new in this time period, is a new kind of white-collar middle class. We have a very simple way in this country of talking about the middle class, and as I always say to students, is there are actually middle classes. I mean, we have middle classes as well. There's no such thing as the middle class. I'm very cognizant of having grown up in what I call the lower middle class. It's a very distinct layer of the middle class, right? But there's a new middle class that emerges in Germany in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. And they are associated with things that are peripheral to industry, primarily around banking and insurance, and also a rapidly expanding bureaucracy, right? So we have these two new classes in Germany, which are disruptive. That's not necessarily a negative thing, right? Marx refers to modernity in the Communist Manifesto, one of my favorite phrases, as waves of creative destruction. And it certainly is that, right, for good or for ill. And the creation of new classes and the tensions which emerge between new and old classes is critical to the development of the background for what becomes National Socialism. And I think that you can find similar kinds of developments in American history. The other part of this is that the agricultural sector of the German economy shrinks, and the industrial part of their economy grows. And this also creates a lot of problems because, of course, you need to feed the growing cities. And policymakers are very, very concerned about keeping food prices stable, which actually really hurts food producers. We also have some of that, quite a bit of that, if we think about our dairy farmers in particular, right, in this country. That creates a lot of tension and a lot of resentment. So by the end of the 19th century, we have the emergence of a new industrialized modern Germany. And there are winners and there are losers. And the losers are resentful, right? And again, for reasons I don't think that we can blame them for. They are the losers of industrial modernization and urbanization, right? One of the developments which goes along with that in Germany in the late 19th century is rising anti-Semitism, right? Because as people feel that they are losing out, they're losing out to a modern economy. They are looking at capitalism as a threat to traditional ways of life. All throughout Europe, Germany is not at all unique in this respect. Anti-Semitism becomes a response to that. This notion that the Jews are responsible for these machinations on a global scale, right, that are displacing people. This was even more true in France in the late 19th century than it was in Germany, actually. German Jews were the most highly assimilated, acculturated Jews in all of Europe. It is often said by people like me that if you were to say to kind of the average European in 1900 that this thing would happen, the attempted annihilation of all of European Jews, where do you think it would happen? People would much more likely have said France, Austria, or Russia. Germany would probably not have been close to the top of that list. And that makes, of course, what happens even in a way much more remarkable. The change within Germany, when Germany was not around 1900. Think about the 1890s with the Dreyfus Affair, if any of you are familiar with the Dreyfus Affair in France. I mean, we're talking about the height of anti-Semitism around false accusations against a Jewish officer in the French army for treason. Right. The one with, I'm trying to remember the actor who plays Dreyfus. Yeah, really compelling, really extraordinary story. But in any event, that's all, this is what I say is dangerous with a historian, because you just want to keep filling in the pictures, right? So World War I happens, right? Absolutely devastating on all levels for Germany. And the Weimar Republic is the result, right, of World War I, the loss for Germany in the war. And the political parties which emerge in post-war Germany are rooted in that same kind of political landscape that existed before the war. One of the big differences is that the proletariat, the industrial working class in Germany, in the 1880s and the 1890s, solidifies into the first, outside of the United States, actually the first modern political party in the history of the world was the American Democratic Party, which formed in the 1830s. But the first modern European political party is the Social Democratic Party, which emerges in Germany in the 1880s and the 1890s. They had actually been banned by law from political organization until the early 1890s. But when that ban is lifted, the Social Democrats form the first modern political party in Europe. And by the eve of World War I, they're the largest party in the German parliament, the Reichstag. So they emerge as a new political party, right? The other important political party which spans this whole time period is called the Center, or in German Zentrum. And the center is a Catholic party. Germany is predominantly Protestant, but it is a large minority of Catholics. Bavaria, as a lot of you know, if you've ever been to Bavaria, very, very Catholic. The Rhineland along the western border with France is also very Catholic. And the Catholic Center Party is also kind of a through line here. They form in the 1870s and continue through into the Weimar period. So in the 1920s, what we see is a variety of political parties. In fact, I brought a handout, probably not enough, but if you can share, which gives you a sense of the political factions in Germany during the Weimar Republic. And I've kind of put them out here on a little kind of grid from left to right and said a little bit about each of the parties. What's kind of most notable immediately about the political parties in Germany in the 1920s is that they're all kind of silos. Each political party belongs to a specific social and economic group, right? So on the far left, we have the communists. They broke away from the Social Democrats toward the end of World War I, right? They are a Bolshevik party. They are a revolutionary party. One of the things I always tell my students is that one of the things that we have to actually come to grips with is that when the Nazis in the late 20s and early 30s were talking about a communist threat in Germany, it was real. Unlike Trump and others who talk about a communist threat in America, which is obviously completely ridiculous. There's never been any meaningful far-left party in this country. But there was a real far-left party in Germany. It was Bolshevik, it was revolutionary, and it was beholden to Moscow. They got their orders from Moscow. Those things are all actually true. Just next to them, I don't want to say to the right, are the Social Democrats. This is also a Marxist party, but it is not a revolutionary party. That is, they are an electoral party. They're a democratic party. They want to win elections and bring in socialist reforms by winning elections.
Did the communists field candidates?
Yes, they did. Yes, yep. The communists ran in elections. Yeah, they tried some of you might be familiar with the so-called Spartacist revolt. It's a communist revolution in 1919, January of 1919, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, that was suppressed. But beyond that, yes, they fielded candidates in German elections. Moving more toward the center, we have the German Democratic Party. It was referred to as the Professors' Party. Had a lot of people like me in it. These were kind of the educated upper middle class. A lot of bankers, lawyers, college professors. This is where most German Jews who were politically active in the German Democratic Party. Then we have, in literally the center, is the Catholic Party. The Catholic Party, like I am a Catholic, still kind of struggling with my relationship to the church, but I'm a Catholic. And like now, the Catholic Party then in Germany was split between a right-wing and a left-wing faction. You had a left wing which was really deeply concerned with social justice issues, with the plight of the proletariat, with poverty, with uneven distribution of wealth. And you had a right-wing Catholic Party which was concerned with all sorts of sinful behavior, right? Culture war kind of stuff they're familiar with. So the Catholic Party was kind of split between those two wings. As we move a little bit further right, there's the DVP, the German People's Party. This is a pro-business, pro-military party. This is kind of their Republican Party, if you will. Gustav Stresemann, who was an extremely important businessman and won the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, for trying to reconcile Germany with the West, was a member of the German People's Party. They were casually anti-Semitic in the way that all right-wing parties were anti-Semitic across Europe at that time. They were largely interested in serving the interests of big business. That's where Stresemann comes from. And so they were really interested in trying to get Germany kind of back into the community of nations, largely in order to resume trade, commerce, and get the German economy running again. Moving further to the right, we have the German National People's Party, the DNVP. This would also kind of fit into our Republican Party. This is the thing about having two parties, right, is our two parties contain multitudes. And both the DVP and the DNVP would be in our, what we would think of as our Republican Party. The DNVP were largely rooted in rural areas. They were a reactionary political party. That is, you know, they saw urban areas as centers of sin. They were concerned with racial miscegenation. They were concerned with secularization. And they were also very concerned about the impacts of modernization on the agrarian economy, as well as the agrarian lifestyle. Now, that's kind of the scene coming into the Weimar Republic. The Nazis are new on the scene. Bless you. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, we could do a whole thing on the name of that party alone, right? National Socialist, right? These would seem to be oxymoronic. These things would seem to not go together, but I won't go into great detail about it. But that was part of the kind of genius of the Nazis, was to meld these terms in this concept of National Socialism, which they did not invent, but they were able to skillfully deploy. They emerge on the scene as a new party in the early 1920s. They are, for most Germans in the early 20s, the Nazis are indistinguishable in some ways from the communists. One reason is that there were people who had been communists who became Nazis. This is, again, not unique to Germany. Mussolini had been a socialist before he became a fascist, before he effectively invents the Italian Fascist Party. So there's a lot of crossover between the communists and the Nazis. They're also both in the early 20s revolutionary parties. Unlike the communists, until 1924 and after, the Nazis do not compete in elections because they reject Weimar democracy, right? So they are a revolutionary party. As you all probably know, in 1923, Hitler tries to emulate Mussolini, his march on Rome from 1922 when he took power. And we have the failed beer hall putsch in Munich in 1923. He goes to prison for a little while. He should have been kicked out of the country after he got out of prison because he was not a German citizen. He wasn't. And he refounds the Nazi Party in 1924 as an electoral party. But in the early 20s, they're not all that different from the communists. They're a revolutionary party, and they're also a party that really embraces political violence, street fighting, assassinations, bombings, those kinds of things. Right? So that's just kind of a broad stroke. As I'm going to hope to make clear in a few minutes, it's very much to the Nazis' benefit, actually, that they are a new party. Right? As I said, all of the other parties, the communists and the social democrats, the German Democratic Party, the German People's Party, the German National People's Party, they all had existing kind of electoral bases. And they were very siloed, right? It was very, where you lived, your education level, the work you did, really determined which of these parties you were probably going to belong to. What the Nazis do so successfully, and I think this is what Trumpism has also done very successfully, is actually to create a sense of a new big tent kind of party that goes across traditional political boundaries. And it creates a sense of something which is really, really new. And when people are radically discontented, disenchanted with the political system as it exists, the novelty of this movement that pulls people away from traditional kind of boundaries and borders and ways of thinking has a really powerful impact on people. So the Nazis come along on the scene as a new party. Now, early in the Weimar Republic, the biggest threat is, in fact, from the left. As I said, there is a failed Bolshevik revolution in January of 1919. The Social Democrats make an agreement with the German army to suppress that communist uprising. There's a briefly successful communist uprising in Munich before it's put down by something like an early fascist reactionary movement in Munich. So the far left is actually far more dangerous to the Republic in the early 1920s than the far right is. The far right is very disorganized, and as I said, for kind of the average German, there isn't a lot of difference between the two, right? They're all just a bunch of thugs, right? They're a bunch of street fighters, they're revolutionaries. In the early 20s, a lot of Germans are attracted to the center and the center left because they want stability, right? We've got the period of hyperinflation that everyone's probably familiar with, right? Massive, rampant hyperinflation in Germany, economic and political destabilization. And during this period, the center and the center left are able to carve out a coalition government that lasts throughout much of the mid-1920s and stabilizes Germany. Germany is stabilized economically by the Dawes Plan. This is an American plan, loans that stabilize the German economy. They also restructured Germany's war debt, the reparations that Germany had to pay after the war. Early in the 1920s, one of the problems with hyperinflation was that the Germans were supposed to pay reparations regardless of how their economy was doing, right? So it was the same amount no matter what. And if that amount was simply unpayable because the German economy was just not productive enough, then of course it was crippling. So one of the things that the Dawes Plan does is to structure reparation payments around the growth of the German economy. So if the economy grows more, you pay more. If it grows less, you pay less. And this ushers in a period in Germany from 1924 to 1928, which we referred to as the stabilized period. It's economically stabilized. It's largely politically stabilized. In the election of 1924, we see that the radical parties, the communists on the far left and the Nazis on the far right, are insignificant in terms of their the share of the electorate that they win, right? The center and center-left parties in particular do well in this time period, right? Because people want stability, right? And the reestablishment of economic relations with the wider world is important to that stability. So we have the Dawes Plan, and we have a series of treaties called the Locarno Treaties, which bring Germany back into kind of the world community, and Germany then is also able to enter into the League of Nations. But even within what we call the stabilized period, historians debate kind of how stable the stabilized period was, because we can see that there are a couple of really important groups who do not benefit from the economic productivity in the middle of the 1920s. And they're really important because they become the first foundation of Nazi electoral success. All right? Hitler refounds the party when he gets out of prison in 1924. He says, we're going to be an electoral party. We're going to win elections. He brings in people. This is when Goebbels comes into the party. He brings in Hugo and Otto Strasser, are important thinkers who come into the party at this time. A number of political system builders gather around Hitler, rethink the Nazi Party right around 1924. The two major kind of groups of Germans who do not benefit from the stabilized period are farmers and lower middle class folks, people who work in trades, individual small business owners, right? And the reason why, one of the reasons why they don't succeed during the stabilized period is because in order to keep the economy stable, in order to keep prices down, right? That had been the big fear because of hyperinflation. You need to make sure that goods are not too expensive. That's really good for consumers. It's not good for producers. It's not good for the farmers who are dealing with food price controls, right? So they're selling food into the markets of the German cities at much lower prices than it costs them to produce that food. So they're really, really resentful. And as I said, kind of the lower middle class, craftsmen, small business owners, they're in a similar kind of boat, right? Their margins are very, very small, right? They may even be losing money in a market that is concentrated on keeping prices down. These are the groups who form the initial basis of support for the Nazi Party. Interestingly, if you take a look at the electoral success of the Nazis in the late 20s and early 1930s, sadly, you could map it over where the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, far-right party today, you could map them over each other and they're almost identical. So when you look at the success of the neo-fascist party in Germany, same parts of Germany. And that has a lot to do with the failure of unification in the early 90s, right? But the Nazis understood how to build a base. And as I said, they created a big tent party. They didn't adopt the notion that these are our people. The industrial workers, these are our people, right? Middle class professionals, these are our people. Industrialists, these are our people, whatever. What the Nazis did was to reach out to anybody who was remotely receptive to their story. And what they did most successfully in the second half of the 1920s, before the Great Depression, is they went out and they campaigned in what in American parlance we call flyover country, right? They went into small towns. And there are some small German towns in this time period. 400 people, 800 people. A lot of towns under 1,000 people, right? Politicians never went out to campaign in these towns, ever. Why would you? It's just not electorally worth it. Well, it was to the Nazis. And they would go out and they would have kind of what would look to us like Oktoberfest. You know, they were a Bavarian party to begin with. So you'd have bratwurst and beer and what I call Oompa music and speakers. They were also really brilliant in terms of how they recruited speakers. Another thing that the Nazis did in the late 1920s, even before the Depression, was you had a lot of folks on these farms in rural Germany. The husbands would have to leave the farm to go into the city to work, to make money to help support their families. This would leave behind the wife and small children to run a farm. Well, the Nazis would go out into the countryside with work crews, and they would work on farms, helping to support these families. And they would say, look, the system is failing you, right? And if things get really bad, you can go on welfare, right? But nobody is helping you survive. No one is helping you thrive, right? You don't want to be on welfare. You want to run your farm, right? The system is making that impossible. So the Nazis created a kind of mobile rural welfare organization. And this brought in small numbers of people at first, right? But it really started to plant roots, particularly in Eastern Germany, and particularly in areas where people felt that the political institutions of the Weimar Republic were really failing them, right? If we take a look at the election of 1928, there's something really interesting that happens. On the face of it, this is before the Depression. This is later in what we call the stabilized period. On the face of it, it looks like people are embracing the center and center-left parties. The Nazis don't do well in 28. The communists don't do well in 28. The biggest difference between the election of 1928 and the election of 1924, the writing on the wall, is that the number of people who cast protest votes, who vote for little teeny tiny third parties, goes from about 8% to almost 14%, right? At the time, it didn't really register as an earthquake with people, but that was really an important indicator as we look back on it now, because what it meant was people were really unhappy with their choices. They hadn't moved in the radical directions of the left and the right yet, but they were moving away from the center and center-left parties. Then the Depression hits, right? And when the Depression hits, you have this immediate, powerful example of the failure of the system on all levels, right? There's a huge debate over welfare policies in Germany after the Depression hits, and eventually there is an attempt to rein in prices, concerned not to repeat the mistake of hyperinflation. They had an austerity package, a massive austerity package, which led to very high unemployment and made people feel that the only alternative was a party or a movement that would blow the system up. The system was a failure, right? The system didn't work on their behalf, right? There was a profound sense by a lot of Germans, that a lot of Americans feel today, that the status quo institutions exist for the benefit of a small number of people who manipulate the system for their own benefit, while the vast majority of people get screwed, right? And so they were looking for an alternative. So after the Depression hits, we see a movement to the extremes. The first casualties of the Great Depression are the center parties. Not literally the center. The Catholics actually do quite well, that Catholic Center Party, because they're Catholics, right? So, I mean, they vote Catholic. That's just they are Catholic, they vote Catholic. But what I mean is like the German Democratic Party, the Professors' Party dissolves entirely by 1930. Kind of reforms as a right of center kind of party, but it never really comes back. The German People's Party, which is a slightly right of center party, after the death of Gustav Stresemann, becomes largely defunct. The two major parties that occupy the right and left center simply disappear. The other thing that happens, and this comes back to my 3 points at the beginning of my talk, is that the right consolidates. So in 1929, there's a referendum over the Young Plan. The Young Plan is a reworking of the Dawes Plan. It just has to do with restructuring war debt, reparations payments. And the DNVP, which was run by this guy named Alfred Hugenberg, who's kind of the Rupert Murdoch of the day. He was a media baron. The DNVP joins with the Nazis to oppose the Young Plan, because they say this is the West, the United States, Britain and France trying to impose their will on Germany. They fail. The referendum passes overwhelmingly. But it does two things. Number one, it effectively, Hugenberg is one of a series of people who thinks he's smarter than Hitler, he's savvier than Hitler. I am going to organize this alliance between our parties, and then I'm just going to consume the Nazi party. It happens the other way around. Hugenberg is outfoxed by Hitler. Hitler consolidates the entire right after 1929 under the mantle of the Nazi party. Let's see where that leaves me. So by the early 1930s, Germans feel increasingly like they only have a choice between the far left, the communists on the one hand, and the Nazis on the other hand. Well, as I've said, one of my other points, right, is the fragmentation of the left. The fact that the left could not unite, could not coalesce, could not come together around a platform and a series of issues, left them really kind of politically impotent, while the right had coalesced around an objective. And what was that objective? It was to destroy democracy. Right? The left couldn't agree to defend democracy, in part because one part of the left also didn't believe in democracy. The center's gone, and the right, as I said, coalesce around this commitment to the destruction of democracy. Right? So to return to my kind of main 3 points, as I said, a weak conservative establishment. If Hugenberg and the DNVP had been able to win elections without an alliance with the Nazis, they would have done that. They would have not brought the Nazis into this larger alliance where they were eventually consumed. I think there's a pretty clear comparison, right? You look at the Mitt Romney Conservative Party after 2012. They didn't know what they were going to do. They made an alliance with an anti-institutional, not at all conservative, radical, far-right populist movement. And that populist movement has consumed the Republican Party. Conservatism in that mold effectively doesn't exist anymore, right? And they coalesce around their opposition to central principles of representative democracy. At the same time, our left is fragmented, right? Where we are unable to coalesce around a series of issues for a variety of reasons, right? And the center is, well, we'll have to see whether or not there's a viable center. That is yet to be determined. And then, as I said, the loss of faith in the institutions. You know, I said at the rally last week, I said that we have to recognize that one of the reasons why so many Americans voted for Trump is because they feel like the system is broken. They feel like the system works against them. And they are so disenchanted with the system that they would prefer someone who will take a wrecking ball to the system, as opposed to somebody who either represents the system or even just talks about how to kind of fix it, right? They want a radical solution. And we have to recognize that, you know, when we get back into a position of the majority in the legislature and in Washington, we need to meet the needs of Americans. We need to not be afraid of bold policies and bold actions, because clearly that's what people are interested in, right? And one other piece that I want to kind of bring up in terms of seeds that were planted in Germany that I see, unfortunately, parallels here. Many of the policies that the Nazis exploited in the early 30s had their roots even during the Weimar Republic. Authoritarian tendencies existed even within the Weimar Republic. Now, the most notable example of this is that the president under the Weimar Republic had extraordinary power to act independently of the Reichstag, of the parliament, and to give the chancellor emergency powers. And this was used again and again and again all throughout the 1920s under democratic parties, democratic, right, in lowercase d, democratic parties, right? So the precedent of using emergency decrees to rule without the Reichstag was already very much in place in the 1920s and early 1930s. And I think that we've got a similar situation here. Congress is broken. Congress has refused. We haven't declared war since World War II, and we've fought a few wars since then, right? Congress has completely abrogated its responsibilities and is simply not functional. Our founders expected that the three branches of government would be jealous of one another, that they would compete with one another. That's what checks and balances are all about. Congress is the first branch of government, Article 1 in the Constitution. And yet we can all see that Congress, under Democrats too, has abrogated the responsibility to act as an independent branch of government. So I'm afraid that that is also a parallel between the 1920s and 30s in Germany and what we're seeing here, is a legislative branch which is simply not functioning. And therefore we have, certainly from, I mean, we could see the tradition of the imperial presidency from Nixon to the present is a response to Congress simply not doing its job, despite the impeachment of Nixon. That was kind of a speed bump in the march of the imperial presidency. And the Patriot Act and what happened after 9/11 moved us even faster in that direction. So what I'll end with is some things where in terms of I think we stand, hopefully, if history never repeats itself, right? But there certainly are frightening similarities. What can we hope? What can we work toward, right? How can we bolster our representative democracy? One is, at the moment, We all have varying degrees of optimism, cautious optimism about this. The moment our courts are holding, this is by no means a rose-colored vision of these things. I'm not overly optimistic, but we are, I think, still seeing our courts holding. We're seeing an all-out assault on our courts. We're seeing judges being arrested. We're seeing a president, not for the first time, not obeying court orders, not obeying even the Supreme Court. But courts are still holding, far more than they did in Germany. The courts were very much aligned with the far right in Germany in the 20s. So we need our courts to hold. We need to find ways to bolster and support the courts. So far, our military is holding, right? Our top-level military folks are, as we could see when Trump initiated his attempted coup in 2021, they are not interested in being a part of a Trumpist coup. Two things worry me. Number one, Trump is purging the upper ranks of the military, just as Hitler purged the upper ranks of the military in the 1930s, so that is frightening. And there's also a significant disparity between the upper ranks and enlisted ranks in the military. There is far more right-wing support among the enlisted ranks in the military. This was true in Germany too, that the generals tended to favor the military establishment in Germany and therefore to kind of resist Hitler where they could, but the enlisted ranks tended to be much more nationalist and right-wing. So Hitler kind of thinned out and purged the generals' ranks. I think we're seeing that here, and that concerns me. But these are two bulwarks, and for some, probably for a lot of you too, to think of the military as allies in defense of our democracy maybe doesn't come naturally to us. But we do need, I think, in this moment to have a military establishment which rigorously maintains its independence from the political process. And certainly Trump is trying to undermine that. Right? And then the last point I'll make is that the left and the center left have to hold. We have to hold. We need to get over the circular firing squad mentality. And we need to, progressives and moderates and this and that, and it's your fault, whatever, right? That is in the face of a right which is consolidated around a fundamentally anti-democratic agenda. We have to get past that stuff, right? And we have to recognize that Republicans or Democrats from West Virginia, I didn't love Joe Manchin, but it was either Joe Manchin or a Republican, right? Democrats in West Virginia are not going to be Democrats in Massachusetts or New York or California, and that has to be okay. The caucus that we help lead, like Democrats from Keene and Walpole are not going to be the same as Democrats from Claremont, right? And other parts of the state. Or exactly, or Manchester and Nashua.
And there are a lot of them.
Yeah, and so we need to get over these grievances and coalesce around a lowercase d as well as capital D, democratic agenda, right? So these are the kind of the larger issues. Hopefully, I know it's opening the fire hose. I hope I made it coherent and enough in terms of kind of how German democracy met its end, and unfortunately where I see parallels that we're facing now, but also some places where we really need to focus our energy in order to prevent a similar kind of outcome.
Woo.
Thank you. And I have, by the way, I think the two best books on this topic are Thomas Childers' book, The Nazi Voter, which is a really deep dive on all of the German elections during the Weimar Republic and a demographic breakdown of electoral results. It's really good. And then for a kind of longer but master narrative, Richard Evans, if anyone is familiar with Richard Evans, he's a master historian of modern German history. His book, The Coming of the Third Reich, is also a really great, more social cultural history of this period from the end of World War I to the rise of the Nazis. So those are a couple of books that I would recommend if you're interested in going deeper.
Could you compare that book to William Shire's book, Rise and Fall?
Yeah, well, Shire's book, which is,
Question, Nick?
oh yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
So comparing Evan's book to William Shire's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, Shire's book, which is of course iconic, is from his reporting. So it's very, very good, but right, so it's a contemporary account. And Evans is using a lot more, as a historian does, right, a much wider variety of sources to tell his story. But Shire's book, as I said, is of course iconic as a firsthand account of what was happening in that moment.
Hey, Dad, let's
Let me
do
ask,
questions.
how long do we have the room, Jane?
I mean, you know, we can stay for a while.
15 minutes?
What time? Summer 25? Yeah, I mean, if you stay till 8, you know.
Okay, all right.
Phones.
One other thing, if you didn't get an email about this event, come see me and I'll pass this around, put your name and email address, be sure to put you on the list.
And write clearly, everybody. We've had a problem with the last one, so make that everybody look good.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, also, I'd be happy to, some of you may get my legislative updates I send out. If anyone else wants a copy of my legislative updates, I've been sending out, I don't know, you can indicate that, or if I can just use the list you guys come up with. Or.
Yeah, by the way, Dan is recording this and we'll produce this if anybody wants to.
Yeah, we'll put it on YouTube and you can all watch it. Let's do some more questions.
Yeah.
That's a good question, Peter.
Yeah, I was listening to your lecture or presentation in parallel with Germany, Hitler's Germany, and current American political condition. But there is a big difference. I don't want to give that much credit to Trump, who could feel the current of the tide of the current.
Yeah.
And when he ran for the first time, he didn't have any aspiration other than promoting his own business. And then the second time he ran, his priority is revenge. And I don't think Hitler was the same framework when he had this rise of Nazism.
Yeah, I think we should be careful of comparisons between Hitler and Trump for that reason, but we can still compare the movements, right? But no, I think you make a really good point. I mean, I would say one of the main differences is that Trump is simply an instinctive fascist, right? I mean, he's not a reflective fascist. He doesn't know anything about, right, yeah, exactly. Whereas Hitler was a relatively knowledgeable person who had a plan. He didn't have it all planned out. But yeah, I definitely think we should avoid trying to make those comparisons. I think that's an excellent point, that there is a big difference. One of the things that's similar, though, I think, is that they both had a kind of genius for the popular culture, right? So Trump with tweets, for example, right? And the fact that he was on television and whatever. And Hitler very closely studied film of the time period and was deeply moved by, and would practice in front of mirrors as if he were an actor on film. So he was somebody, and there were other Nazis around him, of course, who were really very plugged into popular culture. And this is another similarity, actually. This is not just Trumpism. It's also true of the right in Europe. They are far more skilled at modern mass media than the center and the left are. And that was true of fascists in the 1920s and 30s, actually. They were very adept at the use of that. When the establishment kind of movements were really tied into, again, old media. I talked to students of mine who would come up to me and say, oh, have you seen this podcast, or Joe Rogan and all that other stuff? And I said, you're talking to a guy who reads The Atlantic. And I just like, no, no, I don't watch Joe Rogan, right? But that's a problem.
Yeah.
What did Germany have in terms, I'm sorry I didn't have my hand up, in terms of communication, and what about education? We have Fox on one hand and NPR, PBS on the other, and they're trying to get rid of, at a pretty good clip, get rid of PBS and NPR.
Yeah.
Fox, if you listen to it, it's nauseating, but a high percentage, well, another thing, education, if you look at the ratings of public education in the 50 states, public education, half of the ratings, or lower half, are southern states and states that voted for Trump.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that sort of thing? In other words, the education that the Fox types get about who we are, and the NPR, PBS people get, was it true in Nazi Germany too?
Yes, in fact, this is something that I bring up with my students a lot when we talk about the history of media, is that our notion of a fairly centrist, highly respected New York Times, the networks, right, as we were growing up, whatever, that notion of the media is actually an exception to most of the history of the media, right? That's only the result of regulation in the United States in the middle of the 20th century. Before the 1930s, with regulation of radio, it was the Wild West, right? It was, and this was true in Germany too. Germany had more newspapers than Britain and France combined. But the newspapers were workers' newspapers, socialist newspapers, communist newspapers, bankers' newspapers. There were as many newspapers as there were kind of individual, kind of social groups. There were a few, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, for example, the big newspaper in Frankfurt, was kind of like their New York Times. But it was a wide landscape. Leftists also, communists, they never read anything other than communist newspapers. So the media landscape was very specific. Now again, the Nazis did something that the others didn't do, which is that they produced their media for mass consumption, right? Again, they didn't target just one group or another group. They actually very self-consciously tried to reach across groups, right? Which made people feel that they were actually authentically a more democratic kind of party, because they reached a much broader basis of Germans. Now, the education level, Germans were, as they remain today, very highly educated. Public education is very early in Germany.
National standards?
Well, now, not at the time. And the Catholic states were particularly reactionary when it came to education in Germany, Bavaria, for a very long time. But they did also, the Nazis did do best, as I said, among kind of rural populations at first, right? Which would be, I think, equivalent in many ways to, parts of what we see in terms of, say, the American South, reaching across the band of the southern part of the West and Midwest, that had a more religious-focused education, and an education which stopped at the level of kind of the end of grammar school. So, but it's also important to keep in mind, and we have to keep this in mind about Trumpism too, that Trumpism contains both a segment of the population that Trump himself is called the uneducated, right? I love the uneducated, he said. But there are plenty of people with college degrees and high six-figure incomes who vote for Donald Trump.
That last part is what I'm thinking about too.
Yeah, and so the Nazis, I would say, were similar to Trumpism in that respect. Again, they captured a much broader base across the German population because they combined people who had very low levels of education and very low incomes with people who had very high levels of education and very high incomes. And no other political party in Germany could match that in terms of the breadth of support of their electoral base.
Did they have Citizens United?
Well, they did have a lot of I mean, this is before any meaningful regulation of campaign financing anyway. Yeah.
Can you tell me if I'm on the right track? I had this thought that Trump's fascist takeover, I know that's strong language, I'm just being dramatic, but the one thing he's strategically doing wrong is that he's cutting, going to cut things like Medicare, and then the people will be more in pain. And then I went on this Google wormhole about social programs. Again, if not Jewish, but that in Germany at the time, and they were pretty good at public works programs. Is that true?
Yeah, and that was that combination of National Socialism, right? When I teach my seminar on fascism, I always point out that fascism is not fundamentally an economic political philosophy. Fascism will use whatever economic tools are available to it. Socialism is a political economic philosophy. So is liberalism. Fascism is really very pragmatic when it comes to economic policy. And one of the things that Hitler wanted more than anything was for Germany to become economically independent, right? So that other countries couldn't choke it off through choking off trade. And so he wanted to control the economy as much as possible. And part of that was the creation of a really robust kind of welfare state. And he also did a lot of the things, there were really interesting similarities between there's a book called Hitler's First 100 Days by Peter Fritzsche, which is really good. But between what Hitler does on the economic front in his first 100 days and what Roosevelt does in his first 100 days. So you're building roads, right? You are solving the problem of mass unemployment through government works programs. So yeah, there are some interesting similarities, right? And as long as you weren't a socialist, a communist, a Jew, homosexual, Roma, Sinti, right? All of these other groups who were defined as being outside the folk. If you were what was called a Volksgenossen, a racial comrade, then there was effectively full employment.
Any more, maybe?
Could I ask you something? You said the third rung was that the left needs to coalesce and hold. How do we do that?
Well, I think that we need to put preserving democracy as our kind of fundamental goal, right? And that requires us to compromise on issues that we may find it morally very hard to compromise on, right? Because democracy requires us to meet somewhere in the middle between views that are very different from one another. And we have to be willing to compromise on issues that morally we find very difficult to compromise on.
So when you say compromise, for instance, our senators Shaheen and Hassan voting and approving Scott Bessant to be Secretary of Treasury, I feel that that's a bridge too far, that they're compromising our democratic principles by
No,
being in the...
that's a good point. Right. So the question is, what do I mean by compromise? I mean compromise with other Democrats that we disagree with. Let's see that.
And I think that there are a couple of strands here that come together for me. The thing that Trump is doing that's different from both the Nazis and Roosevelt, which is a combination I hadn't ever thought of in my brain before at the same time. But it's a good point. What Trump is doing in many ways is destroying the social safety net.
Yeah.
And for me, what I hope we will coalesce around is the notion that people deserve health care, people deserve education, people, dear God, deserve housing. You know, we know here that housing is the #1 issue for most people in this state. What have we done about it in the New Hampshire legislature this year? Nothing. Because we are so caught up in the debate between should we have Concord lead and dictate everything, or should we keep local control? And everything falls down about that. But I hope that we will come together around certain principles. I saw a wonderful map, and I don't know if it's true or not because I haven't had time to research it, but it was purporting to be percentages of people who want to diminish Medicaid. And there was apparently nowhere in the United States where more than 15% of people think that's a good idea. New Hampshire, it's 8%. They're not only because it's actually good for people to have health care, but because if we diminish Medicaid in this state, most of our healthcare institutions are actually going to collapse. So my hope is that that's where the coalition comes, around preserving that stuff.
Yeah, and if I can, the very last thing I want to say, and thank you all for having me tonight, is that I also think it's critically important to preserving to democracy to not write off any of our fellow Americans as beyond the pale. That we have to recognize that we are all part of this republic. We all should have an equal voice in the republic. We can't give in to the us versus them form of demonizing other people. That I think if we're talking about preserving democracy, it requires us to also recognize and hear the voice of people who are saying things that we don't want to hear. That doesn't mean we have to simply accept them or cave into it or accept their values as our own. But democracy requires us to recognize their voice as being equal to ours. In German, the word for vote is Stimme, which is voice. Your voice is your vote. And I think that we are the party of inclusion. We are the party that says that everybody has the right to have their voice heard. And that includes people who make decisions in the ballot box that we obviously disagree with immensely. So,
Sehr gut.
Dankeschön.